Hello, I'm Janet Morana, Executive Director of Priests for Life. Welcome to our program. Well, once again, I went back into our archives, and because this is such an important election year, I found a really great show that Father Pavone and I did with David Barton of Wall Builders, and the title of the show is, Why is this election so important? And even though it was done a number of years ago for the 2004 election, some of the principles that David told us then are still true now. So let's take a look.
How many churches have lost their tax-exempt status for preaching about the elections? Find out next on Gospel of Life. Hello, I'm Reverend Frank Pavone, Director of Gospel of Life Ministries. Welcome to our program. We're joined by Janet Morana, our Associate Director. Janet, Election Day is approaching, and one of the questions we often get is, what can churches do? And unfortunately, a lot of churches and a lot of pastors have been led to think that they are far more restricted than they actually are. When we read the IRS guidelines for tax-exempt organizations, and as you know, the church has agreed to be tax-exempt. Donations are tax deductible, and in return for that particular status, there are certain things we cannot do. But pastors think that the things we cannot do are far more numerous than they actually are.
That's right. You know, people think just because you get up and talk about the issues, like, for instance, life issues, abortion, talk about marriage and the importance of the marriage on the ballot, that is not allowed. It's perfectly legal because you're just talking about issues. You're not endorsing a candidate.
As a matter of fact, if the IRS or anybody else were to tell us that we cannot preach about the issues, they would be violating the First Amendment to the Constitution.
That's right.
Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, it demands that we speak about the issues. That's our mission as a church, to tell people what is morally right, what is morally wrong, not just for individuals, but also for societies, even if those issues that we're speaking about in church happen to be the same issues that the candidates are debating prior to the election. Doesn't matter that they're talking about the same thing. That doesn't make us lose the right to talk about those issues.
Now, very often they bring in that phrase, separation of church and state. And what they do is they're really taking the total meaning of what our founding fathers had about that and diluting it. Because really what it meant was that there would not be a national religion. But religion was very much part of all our founding fathers' documents and all of that. So there's no such thing as this real separation of church and state. And very often what happens with pastors is they're just getting bad legal advice from their attorneys that are connected with the church.
Well, in this program, we're going to get some very good legal advice, because we're going to hear from our friend Jim Bopp, who is advises such groups as Focus on the Family.
That's right.
And National Right to Life. Priests for Life and Gospel of Life Ministries.
That's right.
And Jim, first of all, was a speaker for us at a seminar we held called The Church in Politics, Are We as Restricted as We Think? This was a full-day seminar for clergies and attorneys, and we issued, as a result of it, this booklet containing the talks and containing a nice list of do's and don'ts for pastors and churches. And this is available to our viewers for their information.
That's right. They just need to contact us at gospeloflife.com. Go to our website, email us through our mail at gospellife.com, and we'll be happy to get that resource to them and to them. They should, please, put it in your pastor's hands, because it would really help them.
Because it's actually, the text of it is actually posted there on the website. The point here is, you've already begun for us to make this distinction between issue advocacy and candidate advocacy.
Right.
Churches can and must and have the full freedom to deal with the issues, so that if abortion, as it often is a dividing subject in the election, candidates take opposite positions on it, the church can still preach about abortion during an election. Some people say, oh, well, that's going to help one candidate instead of the other. Well, that's because that's the choice the candidate decides to take.
That's right.
Of course it's going to help one rather than the other. That doesn't take away our freedom to talk about those issues.
That's right.
Candidate advocacy is something different. And that's what we are not permitted to do, is to stand up in the pulpit and say, brothers and sisters, vote for John Smith. He's running for U.S. Senate in this state. we're telling you to vote for him. See, that would be the church taking a position, not just on the issues, but on the actual candidate in the race. That's something we cannot do.
That's right. They also can't say, okay, brothers and sisters, we're now going to pass the hat, make an offering now for John Smith for his election campaign. You can't do that.
Church cannot collect for the campaign.
But you can get into that pulpit and you can clearly preach the issues. And then tell the people, look at the candidates based on these issues.
Well, and that's the other point, too. It's not only that we're teaching about the issues, but one of the issues we're teaching about precisely is the responsibility of people to engage in the political process.
That's right.
So I might not be able to get into the pulpit and say, vote for John Smith, but I can get into the pulpit and say, vote.
That's right.
I can get into the pulpit, I must get into the pulpit and say, brothers and sisters, there's an election coming up. We have a Christian responsibility to vote. We have a responsibility to evaluate the candidates, and we also have a responsibility to know that the primary issue is the right to life. Without the right to life, everything else collapses.
That's right.
So churches can do a whole lot more than they think they can. Why don't we listen to Jim talk about a few of these concepts, and then we'll come back and talk about more applications. Brothers and sisters, James Bopp Jr., an expert on the area of the church, the elections, and the tax law.
Churches have an important role in talking about moral issues as they impact our society. And pastors and priests have a special role to speak out on moral issues, even if those moral issues, as they often are issues that the government deals with. No church has ever lost its tax-exempt status for speaking out on moral issues, even when those moral issues are issues in a concurrent campaign for the election of candidates. The only three circumstances in which churches have ever lost their tax-exempt status is when they have expressly advocated the election or defeat of a candidate for office. Two, when they have given church resources, money, lists, things like that, to a candidate, so they made a contribution to a candidate, or when they've allowed church property to be used to essentially pass the hat for a candidate's election coffers. Those are the only times. Now, that doesn't mean that the IRS hasn't been engaged in some overreaching, as far as I am concerned, where they have been threatening or raising concerns or issuing warnings about what is, I believe, to be legitimate activity of churches to talk about moral issues, to talk about those moral issues in the context of public officials or candidates, as long as the church is not expressly advocating the election or defeat of a candidate. The IRS has put out some advice, and one of the factors that they look at, and I think it's a key factor, is whether or not you've mentioned any candidates. So if you don't mention any candidates, you are simply talking about an issue, or a moral issue in this case, abortion, and the responsibility, the civic responsibility that people have in conducting themselves as citizens in the voting booth. And you know, that's the kind of thing that has always been done by a wide variety of non-profit organizations that is talking about civic responsibility, issues, or moral issues. So I don't see any problem at all with a pastor or a priest talking about an issue. A church can only be held responsible for their own activities. That is, when an agent of the church engages in a certain activity, or that church resources are used for a particular activity. So if some member of a Right to Life group comes onto the church parking lot and distributes literature, that's not the church doing it. That's some third party, and they are responsible for what they do. So there's no requirement that, or there's no liability of the church for some third party's distribution of literature. And furthermore, there's no requirement that you have to, put up a fence, put a minefield, armed guards, and keep people off your premises. If you choose not to engage in, that sort of security, well, that's your option. And really, nothing has changed about that over the last few years.
Well, I'm grateful to Jim, and I hope that you, brothers and sisters, take to heart the advice that he's given us, the clear teaching that he gives all across the country, and let your pastors and others know about what he has said. You notice how he talked about the church parking lots. Now, this is an issue that comes up all the time.
Well, yes, because, sad and lament of the weekend before every election, we have what we call get kicked out of the parking lot Sunday. And unfortunately, pastors feel such an obligation to go run out there and say, get out of here, leave.
They have no such obligation.
And they really don't.
Just
leave the people alone.
Right.
Nothing's going to happen to you. Nothing's going to happen to your tax-exempt status.
That's right.
Let those people put those voter guides out there so they can figure out, who are the candidates that are going to respect the family and marriage issues and the abortion issue in this upcoming election. It's so important. It's such a simple activity.
These are good Christian people. These are disciples of Jesus Christ who have taken to heart his command to change the world, to change society. They're giving witness to the truth. They're informing their neighbors of what they need to know when they go into the voting booth. Who are we to stop them? Oh, well, they're doing it on the church property. Well, Jim just explained. It's not an activity or expenditure of the church if another group is coming in and distributing literature.
That's
the church hasn't paid for that literature.
They didn't pay for those
The church
drops.
didn't organize the lit drop.
That's right.
Leave the people alone.
That's right. What they have to think about is how many churches have lost their tax-exempt status so far in the history of the United States with any political activity, Father? How many have lost?
Well, for allowing material to be distributed in the parking lot, 0.
Okay.
And how many have lost their tax exemption for speaking about the elections and telling people they have to go vote?
How many have lost, Father?
0.
And what about the pastors that, they have what's called a mute spirit, isn't it? Like when it gets to the election. But how many have lost their tax-exempt status because they've said to them, register to vote, or we're going to have voter registration Sunday, next Sunday. Please, everyone, fill out the forms. How many have lost their tax-exempt status, Father?
0.
0.
Not a single one.
It's amazing. So we really, really need the people listening right now to take these resources, take what they heard from Jim. Jim's basically, everything he has said is in that booklet, The Church and Politics, Are We Restricted as We Think, that seminar that we gave, in addition to some other legal experts.
Yes.
And this is what we need to do. We have to put our pastors at ease with this. They get so nervous that something's going to happen.
You see, churches can even distribute voters' guides, and the norms for voters' guide distributed by churches are that the voters' guide itself has to be nonpartisan. In other words, it simply needs to take an objective look at the candidates in the race and their positions on a variety of issues, and simply to say, this is where candidate A stands on these issues, this is where candidate B stands on the same issues. The voter's guide itself that mentions the candidates cannot say this position is right, this position is wrong. Or it cannot have like a check mark. Okay, here's their positions, but here's the one you want to vote for. Right. See, that's where the church cannot go. Now, we're not saying that people cannot go that way. All sorts of political groups and individual citizens can create and distribute that kind of information where they do endorse the right position and the right candidate. But the church, even the church, can hand out a voter's guide as long as that guide is neutral and nonpartisan.
That's right.
The church can inform its people about where the candidates stand.
And let's not forget that the people themselves, they don't have to have a mute spirit. They can certainly, if you know who the pro-life, pro-family candidates are, please tell your friends, tell your church family, endorse that candidate personally. You certainly can.
Even a pastor can, in his personal capacity. As long as he doesn't communicate it through the church, he can't, in other words, you can't use church funds to communicate a pastor's personal endorsement. So he can't put it in the church bulletin, he can't say it from the pulpit. But he can certainly say it at a press conference in favor of that candidate, or by a letter to the editor, or by helping out in various ways, as long as he makes it clear that he's not speaking for that particular church.
And we know
speaking in his own capacity.
We all know through experience that the candidates that are pro-abortion, they do this all the time. I've seen them in churches, up in pulpits practically, being endorsed, and nothing happens to those candidates. And it just seems that we become so timid. We have a timid spirit that we're afraid to just do what the IRS says we can actually do.
Well, again, the church is even permitted to have a candidate come in and speak. Now, again, as we've already mentioned, the church cannot pass the hat for that candidate. Jim has mentioned this already, and or make an endorsement. But a candidate could speak.
That's right.
Could speak on the issues, or could be introduced there in the congregation. The other thing, of course, the church bulletin. What can be put in the church bulletin? And what we advocate is talk about the general responsibility to be involved in the political process, tell people how the process works, remind them of the if your state, for example, has early voting, as many states do.
Remind them to
It's
do
perfectly
that.
legitimate for the church to remind the people, ladies and gentlemen, in our state, early voting begins, next week, and get to the polls early and vote for the candidate of your choice. Nothing wrong with the church saying things like that. You're activating. See, this is not so much about politics. It's about faith. Putting the faith into action so that we help to transform the world. So the bulletin can contain information like that. And the teaching, again, on what the key issues are. God's people have to be attentive to where candidates stand on these issues and lay it out there in the church bulletin.
That's right, and we even have sample bulletin announcements.
We do.
That are, 501c3 friendly, will pass muster with the IRS guidelines. So if you'd like to get those for your pastor, they should just contact us at gospeloflight.com, and we'll get those resources to them.
As a matter of fact, our resource, our educational booklet, Voting with a Clear Conscience, can be distributed by churches. In fact, there's even a legal letter at the beginning of this book giving the reasons why distributing this particular booklet will not violate the tax-exempt status. Because, again, it doesn't endorse a candidate. It simply teaches on the issues, the moral responsibilities of the people of God. Now, another area here, of course, is when the voting days come, whether it's early voting or election day itself, the church can actually help people get to the polls.
That's right.
The church, first of all, can tell its members who are homebound about the absentee ballots. It can make sure they get the absentee ballots, help them to fill them out. There's nothing wrong with this. What would be wrong is if the church said, well, we're only going to register Democrats.
Right.
Or we're only going to help Republicans get to the poll.
Right.
That would be wrong, because that would be a partisan effort. Now, Democratic or Republican groups or individual citizens can do that on their own. They can be as partisan as they want. But when it comes to the activities and expenditures of the church, the fact that we cannot be partisan doesn't mean that we can't do it at all. The church can help get people to the polls. It can use its own transportation vehicles or round up people to volunteer to bring people to the voting booth on election day. That is a perfectly legitimate activity of the church.
And so many churches, Father, have church vans. What about the nursery babysitting services they have during church services? Well, on election day, the very people that run those services on Sunday can come in on election day. And for these young mothers who feel they have a lot of children, that it'd be difficult to go and vote, let the church be open all day for that reason, and let them drop the children off, go vote, and then come back and pick them up. That would really help a lot of young mothers get to the polls.
You know what the church can even do? And this may surprise some people, but the IRS itself will tell you these things. The church can take its list of church members and, first of all, go through that list and call them one by one or mail them and say, election day is coming up, here's where your polling place is, make sure you get out to vote. But you know what the church can also do? It can rent its list to candidates. What it cannot do is give them a break. In other words, it can't donate the list to the candidate. All right, that would be a contribution. That would be wrong. That would be wrong for a church to do. But at the going rate, that is the same, use the same for all people that might want to rent that list. You could even rent this list to a candidate, so the candidate can contact the people with partisan information. Now, whether a pastor wants to do that or not is one thing, but don't try to use the excuse that it's illegal as the reason why you're not going to do it.
That's right.
Well, thanks, Janet, and thank you, brothers and sisters, especially if you're a pastor, if you're involved in church ministry. Ask for our booklet, The Church and Politics, Are We as Restricted as We Think? And once again, the text itself is at our website, gospeloflife.com. We can't use the law or the IRS as an excuse for our own cowardice or our own unwillingness to speak out and to engage our people in the election process.
Many pro-life people worked hard to elect President Donald Trump. That hard work has paid off for the pro-life movement and the unborn. Here are just some of the pro-life accomplishments of the president and his administration. Number 10. President Trump attends pro-life events, has conference calls for pro-life leaders, and issues pro-life proclamations for occasions like Down Syndrome Awareness Month, National Sanctity of Life Day, and more. Number 9. President Trump has called on Congress to pass key pro-life legislation to protect unborn children and to stop the killing of babies born alive. Also, his promise to veto any pro-abortion measures has stopped the House Democrats from advancing abortion. Number 8. President Trump has opposed the efforts of international agencies, including the United Nations, to make abortion an international right, has stopped funding its pro-abortion population fund, has established a commission on unalienable rights, and has taken unprecedented action to rally other nations for pro-life efforts. Number 7. President Trump established a new office to enforce laws that protect people who object in conscience to performing, paying for, or cooperating in abortions, and has ended the Obama mandate that forced employers to cover abortion in health insurance. Number 6. President Trump has had his administration argue in federal court, including the Supreme Court, in favor of pro-life laws. Number 5. President Trump, by multiple actions, stopped funding the abortion industry overseas, in the federal Title X program, and in the states. And his 2021 budget would effectively defund Planned Parenthood. Number 4. President Trump continues to appoint strong pro-life people in key positions in his administration, replacing abortion advocates who were in many of these positions previously. Number 3. President Trump has stopped the funding of government research using the bodies of aborted babies, implemented ethical guidelines for private research, and made it clear that the unborn are included in our efforts to advance health and prevent abuse. Number 2. President Trump appointed 200 pro-life federal judges, including 2 Supreme Court justices. And the number one thing, the first and greatest thing that President Trump did for the pro-life movement was to keep Hillary Clinton out of the White House. These are just some of the pro-life accomplishments of President Trump and his administration. To all of you who voted for President Trump in 2016, congratulations. Your vote paid off. Imagine the progress we can make by giving the president a second term in 2020, and by giving him a pro-life House and Senate who will send him pro-life bills to sign and confirm more pro-life judges. Let's mobilize voters to vote pro-life in 2020. Learn more about the president's pro-life accomplishments and about the upcoming elections at prolifevote.com. Priests for Life has leading influence in 2 areas of the elections, the Catholic vote and the pro-life vote. There are some 70 million Catholics in the United States, and significant portions of some of the key swing states are Catholic. For instance, Wisconsin, 25%, Pennsylvania, 24%, Florida, 21%, and Michigan, 18%. In both of his elections, President Obama won the Catholic vote, but in 2016, President Trump won it by a 52 to 45% margin. Catholics who practice their faith are highly motivated by the abortion issue. Moreover, statistics show a significant portion of voters overall placing high importance on this issue, and among those who do, voting pro-life by a 2-to-1 margin.
Well, I think that when we do see the final vote, the real truth someday, maybe not in our earthly world, but in the next one, we'll find that you won the presidential election, Father.
Priests for Life influences the elections through far-reaching messaging, as well as grassroots training and organizing. Far-reaching messaging. We broadcast live programming daily on many online channels. Daily radio spots on multiple networks, and TV shows several times weekly on the world's largest Catholic media outlet, EWTN, reaching some 95 million homes just in the USA. This programming has taught and inspired citizens to vote pro-life for decades. The messaging of Priests for Life comes also through the non-stop travels of the pastoral team to churches, schools, and pro-life and conservative events from coast to coast several times a week. The team is comprised of powerful voices such as evangelist Alveda King, Dr. Teresa and Kevin Burke, founders of Rachel's Vineyard, and Janet Morana, co-founder of Silent No More.
But you know what? When you and I take up this call and we talk about abortion, if we speak about it in church, we're told we're too political. If we speak about it in the political arena, we're told we're too religious. If we speak about it in the world of the media, it's too disturbing. In the world of business, it's too distracting. In the world of education, it's too controversial. In the streets, it's too disruptive. So abortion, if abortion is wrong, where do we go to say so? We go into the churches, we go into politics, into the media, into business, into education, and into the streets.
I hope you found that inspiring, and I especially like the phrase Christocrat. Are we all going to be Christocrats? And think about, who would Jesus vote for? Now, again, a vote for a certain candidate is not about making them a saint or agreeing with their whole personality. It's by saying, what are the programs and principles that they will put forward? And our current president is a true Christian in the way he's protected the unborn, religious freedom, and so on. So we're going to need your help in this very important election. Here at Priests for Life, we have a full-time employee. His name is Byron White. He's heading up our political outreach department with Father Pavone and myself, and we need you. Yes, we need you on our team. We have a lot of different things you can do, and some of them from the comfort of your own home. Please go to our volunteer form, prolifevolunteer.com. Fill out that form, and Byron will be in touch with you, and you'll be surprised how simple the things are that you can help us with. So I'm counting on you. Be in touch. Again, go to prolifevolunteer.com. Let's all get involved. Let's be Christocrats, and let's win this election. Thank you, and God bless.